Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Welcome to the show, everyone. Today, it's just me in the studio, so I thought I'd give you all an update on all things, me. I'm going to talk to you about how my replica and gear has been working for me so far this season, how the games have been, and I'm going to give you some insight into my current state of mind when it comes to Airsoft and where I'm at with Airsoft currently. Now, before I dive in, a quick reminder about Storm Riders Community Day happening all day on Saturday, August 5th, 2023. There'll be opportunities throughout the day for you to come hang out with me and the other members of our community as we participate in various shenanigans. It'll be fun, it'll be silly, there's going to be some prizes, and really, it's just an awesome way for us to come together as a community and recognize what a great space you have all helped to create. So with that out of the way, feel free to join us. We'd love to have you on our Storm Riders Community Day on August 5th. But for right now, let's talk about Airsoft. And I'm going to start talking about my replica and my gear. So if you recall, at the start of the year and throughout the winter, I was gifted a remote line as well as a tank and a regulator so that I could transition from my AEG to an HPA setup. So the idea and the intent was simply to eventually pick up a Kythera engine and put that into a mech box, throw it into my gun as it was, keep my AEG mech box just in case I ever wanted to go back to AEG. And so that was sort of the plan. So over the first quarter, let's call it, of 2023, we put all the HPA stuff into my M4, and I've been playing this season so far with it, and it's really been a trial and error process. I think when I think about the Kythera in particular, my understanding is that it is designed to be sort of quote unquote drop-in with VFC bodies, but I'm not using a VFC body. I'm using a King Arms body, and a VFC gearbox does not fit in a King Arms body, so we had to make do. So we used an old G&P gearbox that we had sort of kicking around, put the Kythera in there, and that is where the nature of airsoft teching really started to kick in. So it's been a real period of trial and adjustment. Fortunately, I'm surrounded by very competent, knowledgeable people who are capable of providing me with the right insight to help me figure out all the different problems that I've been dealing with. And it's worth noting that I committed one of the capital airsoft teching sins, I would say, in that I changed a lot about my airsoft replica all at the same time. So not only did I put a Kythera into the replica, I also changed the barrel to a 6.01 millimeter barrel, and I changed into a different hop setup that we had. So all of those different variables make it very hard to detect exactly what a particular root cause of the problem is. So regardless, when I started the season, I was using the Kythera and I was finding that my mags weren't feeding. Well, that is apparently a problem that is unique to the HPA and to the Kythera in particular. And so I needed another different part for the Kythera. So I put that in, and that resolved partially some of the feeding issue. But then I was having fitment issues with the hop up and the extended barrel and the barrel itself, and then the R hop. So I wasn't getting to the range that I wanted to. I was experiencing, and I still am experiencing, pressure changes or energy changes between 0.1 to 0.5 joules per shot. Some shots hop correctly, some shots don't, some shots under hop, over hop, etc. There's a lot of different moving parts. And not literally moving parts, but there's a lot of different components that could be at play here and likely are at play. And so my approach right now has been to try and nail down certain parts to make sure that they are rock solid before I move on to other things. One of the typical culprits that you see in the Kythera setup, in talking to people on the Discord about it, is that sometimes the nozzle alignment isn't perfect. And when I mean perfect, again, it's airsoft tolerances we're talking about. So sometimes it's only like a millimeter of play or something like that on either side. So I do have it shimmed and I thought it was pretty good. But just today I did a test where I took dry erase marker and put it on the nozzle, and I shot the replica a whole bunch, and I could see where on one side the dry erase marker had been worn off more than the other, which indicates that the nozzle is connecting more on that side than the other and needs to be adjusted. So all of that is stuff that I need to work on, but my outlook is actually not frustrated about this. In the past, especially when I was working and I had the AEG that we were trying to figure out, I was getting really frustrated because I was sort of at my wit's end. Like, nothing that we did seemed to really resolve all the various issues, and I wasn't getting the sort of the performance that I wanted to. In this particular setup, I know I can get there because I've seen it done before. In fact, Pat had that basically exactly the same setup. The Cathera I have in there, it's Stefan, so I know it's working fine as well. It's just a matter of playing with it and putting the time in to make sure that it gets where I need it to go. And my outlook is actually positive because I feel a lot more comfortable tearing down my Cathera setup than I did with my AEG. There's no springs in there that are going to explode and throw the parts all over the room. There's no, obviously you want to be careful and you don't want to, crush anything or damage anything. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I find my comfort level is much higher. So if I'm like, oh yeah, I have to go crack open the gearbox, in my mind I'm thinking, well, that's no big deal. Versus, with the AEG setup, it would have been, geez, okay, here we go again. I hope Pat's around because I might need his assistance or what have you. So my outlook is positive. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get it where I need to go, but I also know that I'm going to get there. And in terms of shooting, like, yes, it's not shooting as accurately, as consistently as I would like to. Am I still able to be effective on the field? And we'll talk about that in a second, but more or less, yes. So that is still a positive outlook. In addition to the rifle itself being new, of course, having a remote line in a tank has been something that I've been playing with. Earlier in the season, I thought that I would have a pack, like a repro flat pack that would clip directly into my chest rig. I ran that for 2 games, and I found that it was really, the weight of the tank was dragging down my flat pack and forcing my mags to come up my chest, and I didn't like that feeling. I didn't have enough weight on the front to counterbalance it, which is an essential part of those types of kits. Is you're gonna have to have weight on the front to offset the weight at the back. I'm not wearing plates anymore. I'm just using a light chest rig because I wanted to keep it light. So obviously that makes it a bit more challenging. So instead, what I did is I took the flat pack off of the chest rig and I wear the chest rig independent of the flat pack. That way everything stays roughly where I need to go. As a side note, I'm also changing from an aluminum tank, which is what I have now, to a carbon fiber tank, because that's going to be much lighter, and it will allow me to carry, well, actually more air than I'm carrying currently, but the weight will be lower, which also will help, any sort of sagging or anything like that. The flat pack itself is, it's a repro flat pack, right? We have flat pack at home, and the straps kind of suck. So one of the parts that I think I'm going to be changing, looking at upgrading or modifying, at least customizing, is the straps. I find that, they're cheaply made, and they're not, very comfortable for extended duration. They dig into your shoulders. Don't like that very much. I like to keep my pack really cinched in because I don't like stuff flopping around too much. And that means that it really presses on my shoulders. And, for extended wear, and especially thinking about, like Iron Horse, for example, where I'm going to be wearing that pack for hours and hours, I would prefer it to be more comfortable. So I've been looking at Maxpedition shoulder pads, which is one thing, or just looking at what can I do custom by getting someone to make them, like someone like Johnny, for example, who's a capable tailor who could whip something together. So that's another thing that I've been considering. And overall, though, I have to say I don't mind it at all. Now, having played many games, I don't mind the remote line at all. It doesn't get in my way. I do my transitions just fine. And it's like I don't even know that it's there half the time. In fact, I played a game recently where I forgot to start the game, or I started the game, but I forgot to plug in my remote line, just because, again, like, it's not a factor. It really isn't. So if you're considering HPA, but the main thing that's holding you back is the thought of the remote line, like it was for me, because I remember the remote lines from my paintball days, 20 years ago, and they were not great. They've come a long way since then. So I don't even give it a second thought now, so that's fine. The other part of my gear that's new, really new this year, is the Hollow Sun. So it's my first time ever using a real steel red dot. It's been great in terms of a dot. It holds 0 really well. It's nice and bright. It has lots of adjustments. The actual adjustment knobs for windage, for elevation, so to get my dot zeroed, they have a positive click when you adjust them, which feels really nice. So I've been really, really pleased and pleasantly surprised at the lack of sort of transition period for me moving from my SRS, which had it had a really big aperture, to moving to the Hollow Sun, which is much smaller. I mean, it's like a micro red dot basically. But it's been great. And again, I can't stress enough the fact that it feels very rugged and sturdy, and it's easy to pick up the dot. There's no parallax, there's no ghosting. Like, it does exactly what it needs to do. Is it really worth the price compared to my SRS? I mean, understanding that it's more than twice as expensive as the SRS that I had before, I'm not necessarily sure, but I definitely don't regret getting it, and I think just for the reduction in weight, it's kind of nice. But nothing to write home about. And as the battery life as well is much better. The SRS took a AA battery, which was convenient, but I found I would go through a lot of them, and I'd often hit the field and have to rely on the solar cell for for a game before I would switch my batteries out. Not great. This I haven't had any issues with. So overall, looking at the purchases and the changes that I've made this year, the Kythera, definitely a plus, but needs a little bit of work. And anyone who's buying one thinking it's just going to drop in and work, you have another thing coming. Like, unless you're doing sort of the textbook thing, which is getting a VFC body, VFC gearbox, putting it all in place, using the right barrel, using exactly all the recommendations that they make for you. Unless you have that stuff lying around, it's going to be an expensive venture. You're going to have to fiddle with the alignment, make sure everything is okay, use a little bit of tape to shim it, use maybe a plastic card to shim it another way, adjust the screws at the your buffer tube screw, as well as your grip screws, to make sure it's nice and centered. So in terms of that, that's fine. Remote line, flat packed, regulator, no problems there, aside from what I mentioned about the shoulder pads. And then the Hollow Sun, if you ask me if I would do that again, I absolutely would. So in terms of the replicas, in terms of the gear, that has been excellent. One of the pieces of gear that I'm really looking at picking up probably in the near future, and ideally before Iron Horse, is just a change of boots. I think I've been wearing my hiking boots, the Merrell Moabs, for a while, and I'm really looking to try and find something a little bit lighter. So there's a few different hikers that I've looked at, including some of the Arc'teryx, more like militarized versions, that are pretty inexpensive comparatively, but they're excellent and super, super lightweight, which is something that I'm looking for. But that's not a huge priority for me right now. There's a lot of other competing priorities, but certainly before the end of the year. So that's where I'm at with my replicas, with my gear, sort of what my outlook is. Now I want to talk about some of the games that I've played recently, and I played a lot of airsoft in the last couple of weeks. For the first time probably in my life, I've played multiple times in the same week, hitting the evening game as well as the Saturday Open at our local field. This was some of my first experiences playing an evening game. So these are games that usually start at 7 p.m. Our time, and where we live, usually at this time of the year, the sun isn't setting until 9 o'clock. So obviously the days are getting shorter now because we're most of the way through July. But in June and stuff, 9:30, it's still pretty bright. So you have a lot of time to play, but at the same time, the light availability actually drops pretty significantly, even if the sun is up. And it had been a really long time since I've played at that time of the day, and so I had forgotten how hard it is to pick up your BBs, for example. If you're like in the situation that I'm in where my stuff is not working super like dialed right now, sometimes I rely on being able to see where my shots are going, and that is really hard when it's darker. And once it gets completely dark, I mean, you can forget about it unless you have a tracer or something like that. So that was a different challenge for me. And the first time I played an evening game, my mags were not feeding, just as I was talking about with the Cathera engine and the part that I need to put in. That was causing situations where I would be shooting and I thought I would be hitting people, but actually nothing was coming out of my replica because, well, my mags weren't feeding. So that was a bit frustrating, but at the same time, like it was a different challenge. I had a fair amount of fun, but I also knew that I wouldn't be able to really go back and try an evening game until I got to a point where, at the very least, I knew that every single one of my mags was feeding correctly and that issue had been taken care of. And so last week, again, I managed to play another evening game, and that was a lot of fun. We had John come out, we had Jason, a couple of the guys, Josh was out too, and we played the typical games that we usually play at Frontline, so 10-minute village games and all this kind of stuff. But we decided to play an attack and defend game where it was just the Storm Riders team against everybody else defending in the building. So I think it was 5 or 6 of us attacking, and there was probably 11 or 12 people in the building defending. And that was a really fun experience. That was the first time that John and I had really rolled together a bit, let's call it, more seriously in the year. And so we had the opportunity to sort of take the field, set up, think about what we wanted to do, how we want to establish our fields of fire, all this kind of stuff. And it was super fun for us. I think a lot of players who were on the defending side were like renters and younger kids. And so perhaps from their point of view, it wasn't, quite as engaging just because they were waiting for us to come to them. And even though they had, almost double the numbers that we did, that level of confidence just wasn't there because they looked at who was coming up against them, I guess. And, they felt those nerves, which, by the way, like, it doesn't matter who's coming up against you. Your fundamentals are what's going to get you or keep you in the game, right? Using your cover correctly and putting fire out the windows or, any sort of viewports that you have as best as you can to try and keep our heads down. But it was a super fun game. And just from the standpoint of John and I got to work together and maneuver on the field together, which is something that if you listen to past episodes, I was really excited about this season from a training standpoint for myself and John to get on the same page when it came to running games, to running around on the field. And so to get to a point really where I understood what he was going to do basically at any given time without necessarily needing to talk too much about it. On the flip side, it's definitely this game. We weren't running comms. We were just sort of shouting at each other, which, I mean, is fine. It's a random skirmish, whatever. But it definitely could have benefited from comms because we were trying to coordinate essentially 2 elements, putting, a base of fire down on this building. And I firmly believe, and I talked to John after when we did a bit of an after action, there were times where we were trying to maneuver on the field and trying to come up with the best plan of attack. And really, all we needed to do was to get, 60% of our force, putting a base of fire on all the different windows, all the different doorways, and then 1 or 2 players could literally have just walked right up to the building, thrown a grenade in the door, and off you went. Now, we also didn't have any grenades, which this prompted me to, when I got home, make sure that I brought at least one of my tornadoes back into working order. So I have 1 tornado, my other one I think is completely dead now, so rest in peace. But yeah, so those types of games were, that game in particular was really refreshing. Because it let myself and John do some of the things we've been wanting to do. I've talked before again about training for Iron Horse and getting on the same level, shaking out our kit, making sure that we're in a good place so that when we go, there's no chance that anybody feels like we're holding them back, and that we don't feel like we are holding anybody back despite what they might say. So that was a really good opportunity, but I will also share, I mean, I've been playing a lot of airsoft recently, and I'm getting bored. Like, I think when I think about a lot of the games that we play at our local field, and maybe it's the same thing for you, it's a lot of, same, right? Every time we go, we're playing the same types of games for the same duration with the same crew, in the same way. And I distinctly remember playing on Saturday, and myself and John were, moving around the field where we've got this flanking maneuver. And I distinctly remember, I talked about this on the Discord too, but I was in a position to cover and I knew where the enemy was. And I could see perfectly what the next couple of minutes were going to look like. So John was going to move up to me. I was going to come out of cover. I was going to shoot that guy, and his buddy, who I couldn't see, is going to shoot me, and then I'll be out. And I distinctly remember thinking in that moment, I wish I could just get shot now and go back to respawn, because I've seen this before and I'm just done. I just want to go sit down. And that's not, a great place to be when you're thinking about the hobby that you're supposed to be enjoying. And both John and I had a conversation after that game, and we're like, yeah, you know what? This is getting stale. Like, we're not learning and we're not growing in the types of ways that will really help us for a game like Iron Horse. Like he was saying, I'm not concerned. Like, this kind of stuff, we got it down pat. We've been doing it. And, I've been doing it basically without sort of a break, aside from winter breaks, for the last 7 years at the very least. Almost every weekend going to frontline. And then just doing the same types of games over and over. And I want to be really clear, this has nothing to do with the refs. Like, the refs at Frontline are great, and anytime that they, we suggest a game idea, they're like, yeah, let's go ahead and let's try some different stuff. They're considerate of who is at the field to see what kinds of games they're going to run, because if it's mostly renters, there's not a lot of interest in running like a 45-minute game. But the flip of that is we do get a lot of renters, and so as a consequence, most of our games tend to be 10, 15 minutes. And I'm at a point where I'm looking at that going like, this is really not like, it's not really interesting. I know what's going to happen in these games, and it doesn't provide a lot of variety. So we talked to the refs. I was talking to Jeff, one of the refs at Frontline, who comes up with a lot of different ideas about some of the ideas that have been shared in the Discord. And in particular, I remember Matt talking to me about the firefighter game mode that they play at his field in California. And I mentioned that to the ref, and I'm like, that's something we could try. Like, that's a different type of game. There's a type of game that I came up with, which is an ambushed convoy kind of thing, where one team has to start the game slowly marching down the field, and when the ref blows a whistle, they have to stop because their convoy has been quote-unquote ambushed, and then a 10-minute timer starts for that team to defend the convoy while it gets repaired so that it can extract. And then the other team, the ambushers, they take the field when that same whistle goes, so that they don't really know where they're going to have to defend from. The other team doesn't know exactly where the convoy is, but they have to fight it out basically and defend that convoy for that period of time. So those types of games, those are game modes that, I've suggested to the referees to try, and they're totally open to it, right? So kudos to them for being willing to try it, but we don't necessarily get to them all the time, and that does make it a bit stale, right? There have been so many games that I've gone to Frontline and we play, 2 village games. We do a village team deathmatch, and then we switch sides, and we come back and there's a lot more players. So we're going to do another village game, and then we're going to go do a road field game. And then we'll come back, and then we'll do maybe another village game, or we'll do a rush game. And, that's sort of going to be that. And once you've done that so many times, I mean, conservatively, I've done that hundreds of times at this point. There's only so many different routes you can take. There's only so many ways that you can play the game. And so you need to find ways to shake it up. And so different game modes is certainly one thing. But as John and I were talking to Matt as well on Saturday, we thought, well, why wouldn't we go back up to Redcliffe and play a game there, but just with our people? So one of the big challenges with playing at Redcliffe, as we've talked about in the podcast, is that there's a lot of hikers that go up there. There's a very, well, not very famous, but there's a famous hiking trail that goes through all the east coast of Newfoundland, which is aptly named the East Coast Trail. And part of the East Coast Trail runs right by Redcliffe, and it's super popular. There's lots of hikers that go up there. And the challenge for us now is we have to stop our games because of hikers all the time, because we don't want to risk someone accidentally shooting at a hiker. Well, if it's just us, we can actually police that for ourselves. Number one, I trust the guys to not do that kind of stuff. Number two, and we don't necessarily need to play where we've always played. We can try to find new areas and explore different parts of the field and do some of the things that actually we used to do a lot of and that are going to be really fun for us again. So it's, kind of like training and working on foundational stuff, but moving around in the woods, moving around with teams, trying to do a patrol or combat patrol. What does that look like? How does that work? And those are actually skills that for Iron Horse will certainly serve us better than just doing constant CQC. The idea of moving around, trying to be quiet, trying to coordinate fire, coordinate with elements that you can't actually see, visually. They might be too far into the trees or too far away for you to see. And how do you coordinate with them? So those are things that Matt and John and I were talking about. We're like, yeah, we should totally do that. And that is going to reinvigorate some of that airsoft itch for me, and I know for John as well, because it's something we haven't done in years. It's something that is completely different. And fundamentally, it's just going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be the guys, and it's a good opportunity to hang out. And that's one of the reasons that we play airsoft in the first place, is to hang out with people we like. The reason I'm sharing this, of course, is because you might think you're listening to an airsoft podcast from people who have been playing airsoft since, 2006. So it's been, 16, 17 years. And you're like, man, I've only been playing 2 years and I'm feeling a little bored. I'm feeling a little burnt out. We all go through this. All of us. Right? Whether you've been playing for, 2 years or 2 months, you can get bored of a hobby if you do it too much or you do it in the exact same way. And so I think if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, if that can happen to him, that can happen to me. Yeah, it certainly can. And it probably will at some point. So the advantage that you have is that if you're listening to this, there's a good chance that you actually don't play where we play. And you may have access to more fields, different places to play, different types of games. And I would encourage you to avail of all of those options as much as possible to keep things fresh for yourself, to keep it, to have a little bit of variety in your airsofting, whether that is milsim games, whether that's LARP events like the Star Wars event we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, or going to a completely different field and meeting a completely different crew of people and seeing how other people play and how you can incorporate some of that into your own game. So that's a couple of things to think about. The other aspect for me, I think, is that airsoft is more than just going out and playing. There's a lot of other considerations, namely creating content. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about airsoft just in general. Like, what is interesting for us to talk about? What are things that, you, the listener, want to hear? What kind of videos are interesting to you? And all that, again, is challenging, right? And so if you find yourself in a situation, and I think if you think about it in the context of like art, for example, people say, oh, I don't have any inspiration, or I've lost my muse, or whatever. It's the same thing for any hobby, right? You can create certainly discipline and rigor around your hobby and make sure that you're practicing and all this kind of stuff. But sometimes you're going to be less inspired. You're going to have a little bit less sort of get up and go. And you're going to want to just maybe not do it for a while. And that's totally okay, as long as you have sort of a plan to, to get back into it. I mean, you may not. Some people quit and that's it. But for me, I'm certainly at a point where I'm not burnt out, but I can see myself getting there if I keep doing the same things over and over. So that's where I'm at in terms of my current state of mind. It's that sort of burnout prevention. What am I going to do differently? How am I going to keep this interesting for myself? And so I mentioned sort of the practice at Red Cliff with the team. That's one thing. The Storm Riders Community Day in a couple of weeks is going to be different, and it's going to be silly. And I think that will reinvigorate certain different parts of it too. And then, of course, we have Iron Horse, which is coming up. There's no date announced yet, but we know it's going to be probably in the first quarter of 2024. And that is going to be a totally new thing. So for us, so I'm thinking about my kit. I'm thinking about the gear, what I'm going to bring, how we're going to, what we're going to do when we get down there, all those kinds of things. So that's really exciting, and that will also keep me from getting burnt out. So there's a bunch of that stuff that's on the table. Now, that being said, if you have ideas of things that you would like to talk firstly, if there are things that you would like to talk to us about that you think would make a great podcast, I would encourage you to reach out. I would love to have a conversation with you. If you've been following this podcast for a while, you will know we've had many members of our community come on the podcast to talk to us about a variety of different stuff. I mean, just last week we were talking to the Airsoft Organization of South Carolina with Todd and Lucky. And, you know, in the past, we've talked to Ben from Australia, we've talked to Ambo from Germany, we've talked to Jordan and Chaz and Sam. You know, we've had lots of people come on the podcast, and I would love the opportunity to talk to you about something that you would be interested in talking to the community about. So keep that in mind. The other thing too is if there are things that you would like our opinions on, you would like us to expand on outside of just a Q&A. Like if there's obviously if you want to know which gun is better, all this kind of stuff, like yeah, Q&A, fine, whatever. But if there are topics in particular that you'd like us to explore either in video format or in podcast format, you know, let us know, because ultimately our purpose here in the channel has always been to create educational airsoft content. That's fundamentally the only thing that we want to do. Obviously, we want it to be entertaining, but we want you as a listener to take something away. Like, it's fine and fun to watch videos of gameplay and like watch sick plays and like all these headshots and all this kind of stuff, and that's all fine. But when you watch one of our videos, our mission has always been to provide you with some bit of information to take away to your next game. It's like, oh, maybe I'll try that. Oh, you know, Phil and Pat were talking about this thing. Maybe that would help me stay in the game a little bit longer. Maybe it'll help me spot my opponents a little bit faster. Whatever it is, that's really been our objective. So if there's anything that you would like us to talk about in that vein, definitely let us know, because we're open to all of it, and it helps us create content that you will find appealing. So all that being said, that is the outcome. That is my outlook on Airsoft currently. In a bit of a rut, let's call it, where I'm just trying to figure out where I want to go from here. Thankfully, I'm surrounded by people, both physically here in our community as well as in the Discord community, who are here to help. And I think if you are in a similar situation where you're trying to get yourself out of a rut, whether it's a gameplay rut, a teching rut, or anything in between, ask for help, get people's perspective, change your perspective on things, and sometimes take a break if you need to. I'm not there yet. I'm still, committed to making sure that I improve as much as I can, and that means not taking any breaks, but change it up, do things differently, try and get something out of it that you haven't been getting out of it previously. And don't, be afraid to ask for help and support from your peers and from people who are in your community to try and get out of it is my final piece of parting advice. So that's all I really have for you for this week. A bit of a shorter episode. Again, Discord. Our Discord link is in the description below. We have our Storm Riders community happening on August the 5th. Please join. It's going to be a fun day. We don't have all the different activities scheduled already, so if there's something that you'd like to see, definitely let us know. There's a couple of suggestions that have been floating around the Discord, which I will let you discover. But it's going to be a fun day, and I can't wait to see you all there. But in the meantime, that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.